Indigenous people can't come in and save everybody. They can't save the world, because we can't just simply undo and go back to zero. I mean, as everybody knows, all the damage that's been done by colonialism, by the severe disruption of food systems, of ecosystems, right? Turning them into capitalist kinds of systems of property and wealth transfer. But there are these kinds of smaller projects that Indigenous knowledge can intervene in to help treat some of the worst symptoms of the problem, I think. One of my PhD students, she's really involved in thinking about the knowledge that Indigenous hunters have related to cervids, so caribou, deer, and elk. And there's a real concern about chronic wasting disease, a prion disease. It's kind of like mad cow disease, right? But in wild cervids. And so she works between provincial and federal wildlife managers and Indigenous hunters, and is really interested in the way that Indigenous knowledge about cervids and their relationships with the ecosystem, the way that they're moving over the land, how this is changing in climate change, right? How all of their observations and data can go into thinking about how to manage chronic wasting disease. But you've got these racist provincial and federal wildlife managers who don't think Indigenous people have any knowledge. But when they've been living with these animals for millennia, they notice the changes. They butcher the animals. They see what's happening inside their bodies, right? They have a lot of data that's very useful for thinking about managing this disease. And they also know how the landscape has changed, right? They know that the way that cervids eat, they have a sense of how they're contracting the disease, because it's not just from animal to animal, it's from saliva that is dropping onto the things that are being eaten, right? And it can transfer that way. So this is why we need Indigenous people involved in, for example, the development of a technology, a handheld technology in the field that hunters can take out and use to do a diagnosis of chronic wasting disease. Right now, what they have to do is sever the head and send it back to a lab in Edmonton. Who's going to do that? Who's going to do that, right? You need something out in the field. And so those are the kinds of projects I think about. They're really hands-on kinds of projects where Indigenous science is interacting with Western science and technology to try and solve these problems. I don't know that that's as grand of an answer as you want, but those are the kinds of on the ground things that I'm really interested in. And it's very much managing a really broken system.
When I reading some of your work, for me, there is something really appealing and compelling, is that the fact that and probably I've been myself guilty of that in many ways. When people with privilege who may be all committed, we might want to be focused on histories of trauma and destruction of marginalized communities, rather than having a way in which we can amplify actually the alternatives that have been surviving and thriving in ways in the interstices or more in the open, and that we might contribute to make them invisible by expressing solidarity only when there is a question of trauma, destruction, devastation. And maybe when talking with you now, I think that maybe the current situation, that's a problem that it could create, because now as more of the privileged get touched by this devastation or different pockets of devastation, and the solidarity becomes more like a kind of, I empathize because I'm feeling with it, but actually, how can you see, like, how can we make, I think in your work is so there that you are just like, here is what we are doing, and amplifying it and supporting that.
Yeah, I mean, I get up every morning happy and in a good mood, because I get to do work that I think does bring Indigenous people joy that I work with. I work in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. The majority of my students are Indigenous. Many of them are women. Many of them have children, and they've worked in the environmental sector. They are out on the land. They are doing land back projects. They are working with, hunters and scientists and elders and hide tanners, and they are intellectually and emotionally excited about what they're doing. So it's really easy to get up every day and go to work because I get to see the joy that they have in intellectual insights into this work and into sort of building a different, rebuilding kind of indigenous ways of being on the land, right? And involving science and technology too. So yeah, I don't focus on trauma. In fact, in my Indigenous theory class that I teach to the incoming grad students every year, back in, I think it was maybe 2018, I teach a unit on, what should I call it? It's on alternative kinship systems. It's got readings against state-sanctioned marriage, readings against compulsory monogamy. It's got readings about taking joy in sex and desire, right? It doesn't have any sexual trauma in it. And if you Google like Indigenous people and sex, what you're going to get is a lot of trauma out there, missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I actually had some students get upset because I didn't start with trauma. And I said, no, you can go somewhere else on campus if you want to talk about Indigenous people and sexual trauma. We're not doing that in here. We're not doing that. That is all that we hear about. We're going to talk about joy. And they didn't like it. And they went to the dean. And I'm like, go ahead. So I am not focusing on trauma. I'm not. There's enough of that out there. That's all we get in the news cycle. It's a real mark to me, actually, of how disconnected somebody is from Indigenous community when they can only focus on trauma. We have a lot of joy as well. We have a lot of intact cultural practices and social networks. There are just many, anybody who's alive has small moments of joy, even amidst a bunch of trauma, right? And this kind of unifocus on Indigenous trauma is really a problem. I agree. And I've actually really actively turned away from that. Not that I minimize that it's out there, right? Not that I don't have to deal with that in my own social network and family. But it's just not what I choose to focus on and the kind of intellectual production I'm putting out in the world.
I think it's great. And actually, it jumps into something that that I only discovered. I mean, this is the great thing about having been able to have this conversation with you. To go back and see what have you been writing lately and what kind of work and things you have been saying. And I was really, there is this special issue you co-edited on critical relationalities.
With Angela Willie?
In 2019.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
With an introduction that, well, it's really very exciting stuff. I really found that encouraging and also very refreshing in terms of like how to think about our relation with the ecological in a way that hasn't been already, that we are already, of course, and I want to continue doing everything we do, but like this kind of bringing it back also to the way we relate in terms of our sexual relations, our kinship, our friendships with the non-human. I thought that it was fabulous. And so maybe I was really interested then by looking at work you've been doing against this imposition of heteropatriarchal structures.
Yeah.
And how, how you have connected this to how, I mean, there is a passage in that introduction that probably is co-written, but I don't know, but that we need to rethink sex as the central organizing principle of human sociality, the human as the only important unit of relational ethics, and the white supremacist settler and other colonial cultural scripts as ethical measures of belonging through which the naturalized idea of the family emerged historically. Like connecting, so these like both sex as the center of human sociality, the human as the only unit of relational ethics, and the white supremacy set, like how these things are connected. I thought that's a really, and because you spoke about the joy, and then you quote also the ecosexuals, and that, all these different work, but like, yeah, I think that work is fantastic. So maybe,
I mean, I think the ecosexual stuff, and those are friends of mine, Beth Stevens and Annie Sprinkle, and it's not language that I use, and it doesn't resonate with my Indigenous studies students so much. But I do appreciate it. I have thought generatively with and against the ecosexual ideas. It really did kind of help me crystallized for me why sex as an object needs to be decentered. And I think we can get partway to where we need to be with existing tools and language. And so ecosexuality is still kind of, it's not de-objectifying sex. It's still kind of putting sex at the center and using it as an analogy for better relating with the earth, right? And I think that goes partway to where we need to go. You know, not everybody goes all the way towards something. I think in my courses, I focus on literature that's dealing more with Indigenous ecoerotics, right? Where we are trying to decenter sex as an idea, while not, it's not that we want to foreclose what we think of as sex, right? And that form of relating, but it's one way of relating among many forms of relating. And it shouldn't be like this little golden box, you know, that's either kept private and away from public sight or kind of upheld and glorified as kind of some mark of true connection, right? That it's so fetishized in the way that we think about how we should relate in the most important relationships in our lives. And so I try to decenter and de-objectify that in my work. I think precisely for those reasons. I mean, Angie Woolley and I wrote that introduction together, and I think we're very much on the same page with all of those ideas, right? And trying to disrupt that hierarchy of life in which humans are at the top, and certain forms and certain kinds of humans are above other humans, and certain kinds of human relationships are above other relationships. And what we consider sex tends to be at the center of that, both in terms of gender and in terms of practice. Some of the literature that we use are traditional stories. And in many of our traditional stories, humans have relations with non-humans. A woman might marry a bear, or she might marry a stick. You know, Melissa Nelson, who's a Turtle Mountain Chippewa writer, does an analysis of a story of a woman marrying a stick, right? And so there are all these kinds of promiscuous relations. And I wouldn't use the term multi-species. I mean, I engage with multi-species literature and multi-species ethnography. I have friends in anthropology that do that, but species is not our term, right? I mean, we can do science and use that term if we have to, but we think of them as persons and as nations, as different peoples, right? And as with different nations, we don't speak each other's languages necessarily unless we spent enough time learning each other's language. Well, so somebody's like French is incomprehensible to me, right? Because I've not taken the time to learn it. I've not spent the time with people to learn the language. In the same way, bear language is incomprehensible to me. I have not taken the time. But just like there are people that speak French and speak English, there are people that can understand bears. And you know, And so when you had, over the course of history, peoples being fluent in the languages and movements and social practices of non-human nations, they were able to relate with them in the way that we would now relate across human nation languages. And so those kinds of stories reflect those ways of relating. And I think even today, it's not only Indigenous people. I've read articles about people who are, working in the backcountry with bears, for example, who know how to read them and listen to them and understand them. When you spend enough intimate time in close proximity to another being, you learn how to talk to them. Most of us have lost those skills because we're not relating with those beings and understanding the ways that they move through the world and the way that they communicate. So that's what I think about interspecies or eco-erotics. And again, we have to objectify all of these relations in the term eco. We're always stuck in English with objectifying things, right? And we do the best that we can because, again, most of us don't speak Indigenous languages, right? Our grandparents and great-grandparents were forbidden from speaking those languages. They were made illegal. And we are in a moment, especially since the 1980s, of language resurgence in Indigenous communities. So all of my Native Studies majors at the University of Alberta have to take Cree. And I don't speak Cree, but a lot of my students are learning Cree. And so I encourage them to theorize in Cree, to attempt to bring Cree words into the classroom. If they don't like the word like ecosexual, they don't like that word. I said, okay, how would you talk about the kinds of concepts we're talking about in this ecosexual reading? How would you do that in Cree? Go to Dorothy Thunder, our language instructor, go to elders in your community and find out like what are the words you could use to talk about these things. That gets us some way towards being to push beyond the boundaries of how English makes us objectify everything, right? But again, we work with the tools that we have. And if we have to work in English, we work in English. Knowing that it's imperfect, right?
I mean, it's wonderful how you were saying that you do all this organization work, let's say, or community building work, and but I think in the way it's done, there is a real kind of alternative way of looking at different of putting different things and people together, or practices, or whether it's the scientific communities, through the work you mentioned of your grad students on hunters and the kind of knowledge. And I was wondering how this kind of I don't know if you call it multidisciplinarity, but there is something completely radically undisciplined in the way this challenges academic divisions, and not only within academia but outside academia, and like the topics you bring, like in a tradition of some kind of people that from my academic upbringing is feminist, critical, STS, but there is something in the way you are doing this that makes me wonder about how can we, obviously as part of what we are trying to call, or we have been calling reparation of from the ground up, which is like not like giving back, but there is something in those politics of knowledge that I think appears like fundamental for healing or repairing or changing the relations we are in with the earth, amongst us, between different communities. And I wonder, how do you feel about these knowledge politics? Because clearly you have a politics of knowledge that is quite radical.
Well, I mean, I think it's much like what I was just saying. I mean, I think we gravitate towards different methods, right? So I do, in many ways, feel very at home with anthropological methods. I think I've always been kind of an anthropologist at heart, more than I'm a historian. I was just meeting with I'm here at Penn for a month, and I was just meeting with a history of science grad student the other day, and he was telling me about his work, and I just think history of science is fascinating, but I'm a terrible historian, and I use it and I need it and I really appreciate it, but I'm more anthropological in my methods. But that doesn't mean I want to be hemmed in by anthropology and all of its histories, because fundamentally what I am is an Indigenous sovereigntist, right? And our students in Native Studies, they do history, they do law. I've got students now that are doing biology, that are doing genomics, people doing archaeology, people doing religious studies, people doing literature. But we all come together around our desire to support Indigenous sovereignty. But we all gravitate towards different methods, right? We all get excited by different kinds of methodological approaches, different kinds of texts. That's all fine. We need all of those people to do that work. But what comes centrally for us is a focus on Indigenous well-being and resurgence. And the methods are only tools to get us there. And so I really resist, for example, an identity as an anthropologist. And when I go to the American Anthropological Associations, there's a part of me that likes to indulge in all of that kind of navel gazing and identity making. But ultimately, that's not my identity. Ultimately, I'm a Dakota person. That's what grounds me. But I do feel this sort of guilty pleasure in indulging in their anthropological kind of project making, right? There's kind of a voyeurism that I have there, or a way in which but I feel guilty about it. I really do. I have to say, I feel like it's indulgent, it's self-indulgent, because my real commitment is to Indigenous community, right? But I get the attraction to it. I do get it. Because there is a part of me that is an anthropologist at heart. So, and I think that's my approach to all of this. I indulge in it, but I have another grounding kind of project for me that is more central, if that's an answer.
Yeah, it is. It's, I translate it in my own very old style concepts. It's really having a standpoint. You have a kind of, in the old Sandra Harding / Haraway.
Yeah, no, I use standpoint all the time. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, no, I appreciate all these different methods, and I have students coming out of all these different fields. I mean, the thesis defense I have to go to today, her primary advisor is a Métis religious scholar. I don't know anything about religious studies, but I'm reading her engagement with these Métis, which is Catholic and Indigenous kind of religious ideas, and it's fascinating. And it gives me a lot of insight into Métis society and culture. And so I appreciate their religious studies work, right? I appreciate it. And I can see what it's getting us. But what grounds us is our focus on Indigenous sovereignty, right? And then their religious studies methods are in the service of that.